Welcome back, my midnight marauders. Tonight I've got a tale that'll make you think twice before you venture near those old lonely train tracks. This story is filled with eerie whispers, ghostly apparitions, and a darkness that seems all too real. Settle in for the Whispering Conductor. The small town of Ravenswood was known for its tranquil beauty, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. However, the serenity of the town was often disturbed by the mournful wail of the old train that cut through its heart, traveling along the desolate tracks that had been laid down a century ago. The train, once a symbol of progress, now seemed more like a ghost from the past, echoing through the night. One misty evening, a young journalist named Daniel found himself drawn to the tracks. He had heard rumors of strange occurrences and mysterious sightings near the old railway tunnel on the outskirts of town. Determined to uncover the truth, he decided to investigate. As Daniel approached the tunnel, the air grew thick with fog, and the world around him seemed to close in, muting the sounds of the town. The train tracks glistened with moisture, and the only light came from the flickering lanterns along the path, casting long, wavering shadows. In the distance, Daniel saw a faint, flickering light near the signal box. Curious, he walked closer and saw a solitary figure standing by the signal box, a weathered man in a conductor's uniform. The man's eyes were fixed on the tunnel, his face etched with a deep, unsettling worry. "Good evening," Daniel called out, trying to sound casual despite the eerie atmosphere. "I'm Daniel, a journalist. I've heard some strange stories about this place. May I speak with you?" The conductor turned slowly, his eyes dark and haunted. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and filled with a sense of foreboding. "This place is cursed." Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Cursed? What do you mean?" The conductor sighed and motioned for Daniel to follow him. They walked to the signal box, and the conductor gestured for Daniel to sit on a weathered bench nearby. The conductor lit a small oil lamp, its warm glow casting eerie shadows on his lined face. "My name is Samuel," the conductor began, his voice heavy with resignation. "I've worked these tracks for over 30 years, and I've seen things that would make your blood run cold." Daniel leaned in, his curiosity piqued. "What have you seen?" Samuel took a deep breath and began his tale. "It started many years ago, when I was still a young man. One night, I was working the late shift, just like tonight. The fog was thick, and the air was still. I was standing by the signal box, just as I am now, when I saw a figure near the tunnel. At first, I thought it was a trespasser. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely." He paused, his eyes distant as he recalled the memory. The figure was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing perfectly still. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. As I approached, he turned and looked at me, his eyes hollow and empty. Then he vanished into thin air. Daniel felt a shiver of unease. "A ghost?" Samuel nodded slowly. "I didn't believe it at first. Thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it happened again, and again. Each time the figure would appear near the tunnel, always in the same spot, always disappearing just as suddenly." "Did you ever find out who he was?" Daniel asked. "Not at first," Samuel replied. "But I started digging into the history of this place. I found out that there had been a terrible accident here many years ago. A train had derailed near the tunnel, killing several passengers. One of the victims was a man named Jonathan, a railway worker who had been trying to signal the train to stop. He was crushed in the wreckage, and his body was never recovered. Samuel's voice grew quieter, filled with a sorrowful respect. I believe it's him, trying to warn us, trying to prevent another disaster. Daniel glanced towards the tunnel, now shrouded in darkness. Have there been any other incidents? Samuel nodded. Over the years, there have been several near misses and a few unexplained accidents. Each time I've seen the figure before it happened. It's as if he's trying to communicate, to warn us of impending danger. But no one else sees him. They think I'm mad. Why do you stay here? Daniel asked softly. Samuel sighed. Because I feel it's my duty. If I can prevent even one more tragedy, then it's worth it. But it's a heavy burden to bear, and I fear the worst is yet to come. As Samuel spoke, a distant, mournful whistle echoed through the night, sending a wave of unease through Daniel. The old conductor's story was deeply unsettling, and the oppressive atmosphere of the railway tracks seemed to weigh down on him. I need to see for myself, Daniel said, standing up. I need to know if what you're saying is true. Samuel looked at him with a mixture of pity and resignation. Be careful, lad. Some things are better left unseen. With that, Daniel made his way towards the tunnel, the darkness ahead feeling more like a physical barrier than an absence of light. The flickering lanterns provided little comfort as he ventured deeper into the shadows, the air growing colder with each step. As he neared the entrance of the tunnel, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint rustling of leaves and the distant whistle of the train. He stopped and took a deep breath, straining his eyes to see into the blackness of the tunnel. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the same ghostly man Samuel had described, his eyes hollow and filled with an unearthly light. The figure raised a hand as if in warning and then vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled backward, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He turned and ran back to the signal box, his mind racing with fear and confusion. When he reached Samuel, the old conductor looked at him with understanding. You saw him, didn't you? Daniel nodded, struggling to catch his breath. What does he want? Samuel's expression was grave. He's trying to save us. But I fear his warnings may not be enough. The railway's curse is strong, and its hunger for tragedy is insatiable. As Daniel stood there, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed, the distant whistle of the train grew louder, signaling its approach. The night seemed to hold its breath, the fog thickening around them, as if the very air was aware of the impending danger. Determined to uncover more, Daniel decided to spend the night at the signal box with Samuel. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity as the two men kept watch. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Around midnight, the air grew colder, and a dense fog rolled in, enveloping the tracks in an impenetrable shroud. Daniel shivered and pulled his coat tighter around him. Samuel stood by the signal box, his eyes fixed on the tunnel. He's here, Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. I can feel him. Daniel strained his eyes, trying to see through the fog. The lanterns cast long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance and flicker in the mist. Suddenly the figure appeared again, standing at the entrance of the tunnel. His eyes glowed with an eerie light, and he raised his hand in a gesture of warning. "Do you see him?" Samuel asked, his voice filled with urgency. Daniel nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "What should we do?" "Watch," Samuel replied. "Watch and wait." As they stood there, the figure began to move, slowly walking towards them. The fog parted around him, and Daniel could see the details of his old-fashioned clothing and the sadness etched into his ghostly face. When the figure was only a few yards away, he stopped and pointed towards the tracks. Daniel followed his gaze and saw a flickering light in the distance, the approaching train. "He's warning us," Samuel said, his voice trembling. "Something's wrong." Without thinking, Daniel grabbed the lantern and ran towards the tracks, waving it frantically to signal the train to stop. The whistle grew louder, and the ground trembled beneath his feet as the massive engine bore down on him. For a terrifying moment, he thought the train wouldn't stop in time. But then, with a screech of metal on metal, the train began to slow, coming to a halt just a few feet from where Daniel stood. The conductor leaned out of the cab, his face pale and shaken. "What's going on?" the conductor demanded. "There's something on the tracks," Daniel shouted, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "You need to check." The conductor nodded and signaled to the crew. Together they inspected the tracks and found a large tree branch that had fallen across the rails, hidden by the fog. If the train had continued, it would have derailed, causing a catastrophic accident. As the crew cleared the tracks, Daniel returned to Samuel, who stood by the signal box with a look of relief on his face. "You did it," Samuel said quietly. "You listened to him." Daniel glanced back at the tunnel, where the ghostly figure still stood, watching them with an expression of gratitude. Then slowly, the figure faded into the fog, leaving only the silent night behind. The morning after the near accident, Daniel was determined to learn more about the spectral figure and the curse that seemed to plague the railway. He thanked Samuel and promised to return with more questions. Samuel, though exhausted, nodded in agreement, his eyes still haunted by the previous night's events. Daniel returned to town and headed straight to the local library. The librarian, Mrs. Hawthorne, was a kind elderly woman with a wealth of knowledge about Ravenswood's history. Daniel explained his encounter and asked if there were any records or documents about the railway's past accidents. Mrs. Hawthorne's expression grew serious as she led Daniel to a section of the library filled with old newspapers and town records. "There have been many stories about that railway," she said, her voice hushed. "Most people prefer not to talk about it." Daniel spent hours poring over the dusty archives. He found several reports of accidents, but one in particular stood out: the tragic derailment that had taken Jonathan's life. The details were sparse, but he learned that Jonathan had been a dedicated railway worker, well liked by his colleagues. The accident was blamed on a malfunction in the signalling equipment, and Jonathan was killed while trying to prevent the disaster. Daniel also found a journal written by one of Jonathan's co-workers. In it, the man described strange occurrences following the accident, sightings of a ghostly figure near the tunnel, mysterious whispers, and a persistent feeling of unease. It seemed that Jonathan's spirit had been restless ever since that fateful night. Determined to uncover more, Daniel decided to visit Jonathan's old home, now abandoned and overgrown with ivy. The house was on the outskirts of town, near the railway tracks. As he approached, he felt a familiar chill, the same one he had felt at the tunnel. The door creaked open, revealing a dusty interior filled with forgotten memories. Daniel carefully made his way through the house, searching for any clues that might explain Jonathan's restless spirit. In the attic, he found a box of old letters and photographs. Among them was a letter addressed to Jonathan from his wife, Eleanor. The letter was heart-wrenching. Eleanor had written it shortly before the accident, expressing her love and worry for Jonathan. She mentioned a recurring nightmare she had about the railway, a premonition of disaster that had left her deeply troubled. The final lines of the letter were a desperate plea for Jonathan to be careful and to return home safely. Daniel realized that Eleanor's premonitions and Jonathan's tragic death were connected. He took the letters and returned to the signal box to share his findings with Samuel. When Daniel arrived, Samuel was waiting for him, a worried look on his face. "I've been thinking about what happened last night," Samuel said. "There must be a reason why Jonathan's spirit is still here." Daniel nodded and handed Samuel the letters. "I found these in Jonathan's old house. His wife had premonitions about the accident. She was terrified something would happen to him." Samuel read the letters, his expression growing somber. So Eleanor knew, but she couldn't prevent it. Maybe Jonathan's spirit is trapped because he feels he failed to protect the passengers. "We need to help him find peace," Daniel said. "But how?" Samuel thought for a moment. "The railway is having a maintenance shutdown tonight. There won't be any trains. We should go back to the tunnel and try to communicate with Jonathan's spirit." That night, Daniel and Samuel returned to the railway tunnel, armed with the letters and a lantern. The air was thick with fog, and the silence was almost palpable. They stood near the entrance of the tunnel, the darkness ahead feeling like a void. "Jonathan," Samuel called out, his voice echoing off the tunnel walls. "We know you're here. We want to help you find peace." The fog thickened, and the temperature dropped sharply. The ghostly figure of Jonathan appeared, his eyes filled with sorrow. Daniel stepped forward, holding out the letters. "These are from Eleanor. She loved you and knew something terrible would happen." Daniel and Samuel stood in silence, feeling the presence of peace that had settled over the place. "Thank you," Samuel said quietly. "You've helped him find peace." Daniel nodded, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. And maybe now the railway will be free of its curse. As they walked back to the signal box, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a warm glow over Ravenswood. The town awoke to a new day, unaware of the quiet victory won in the dark hours of the night. Well, folks, if that didn't make you want to avoid public transportation, I don't know what will. Remember, always trust your gut, and maybe avoid creepy old trains. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We really appreciate each and every one of you.